The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Wentworth.
Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak to the Treasury Laws Amendment Bill supporting choice and superannuation 2026. While I will not oppose this bill, I want to raise concerns I have with Schedule 2 of this bill that could result in less, not more, choice in superannuation products. Reduced competition in superannuation has a hidden cost on all Australians, and we need to be alive to these risks when making what we may think on the surface seems like a no-regrets change. And other issues that we have had, for instance, in making things like the performance test, some of those changes that we have made in those areas have ended up in terms of reducing choice or reducing dynamism in the super industry, and I do think we need to be much more alive to unintended consequences, which is why I have a second reader amendment to this bill. And so I'd like to say, just take the opportunity to say I move the amendment circulated in my name. Deputy Speaker.
Sorry. Is the amendment seconded?
Amendment and reserve my right to speak.
Call the member for Wentworth.
Hang on. Deputy Speaker, this bill has 7 schedules. While I will not go through each schedule in detail, I note that on balance there are positive measures held within the bill, but I also note that it is, I think, quite inappropriate to include some of these schedules as one bill because they are not the same thing, and I think it means that it does make it difficult to support some bits rather than other parts. I'm pleased to see Schedule 6 lists 6 new deductible gift recipients, including in particular some organisations that I've worked with and in some cases even supported their DGR status, including Equality Australia, the Great Synagogue Foundation and the Parenthood Project. This represents important recognition for these organisations for the philanthropic work that they do. Similarly, I note that the Schedule 6 increases a rebate claimable by wine producers from wine equalisation tax in an effort to provide additional support to Australia's wine industry, and I support these measures. But Schedule 1 and 2 are the most consequential changes and the ones for which this bill gets its name. Schedule 1 amends the Superannuation Guarantee Administration Act to allow employers to request information about employees' stapled superannuation fund from the ATO if the employee has not selected a product during onboarding. This is an important change that will make it just a little bit easier for employers to act in the best interest of their employees by identifying their stapled superannuation product rather than creating duplicated funds when a default is not provided as part of the ongoing onboarding process. Duplication of superannuation products costs Australian workers millions each year, still with more than 4 million Australians holding more than one superannuation account. The more that we can do to minimise unnecessary and unintended duplication, it's a positive step forward. Schedule 2 puts a ban on advertising superannuation products during employee onboarding processes, subject to certain exemptions. This change has come about after a series of cases in which employers were found to be directing new hires towards underperforming financial products to which the employer had a relationship. Perhaps the most high-profile cases of this was MYOB, who was accused in 2023 of directing employees towards an underperforming high-fee fund with the option to stick with their existing fund buried in the fine print. The intent of this schedule is therefore not without cause. We know that many Australians are generally disengaged with their superannuation, perhaps even more so than usual at the point of starting a new and exciting career opportunity. When clicking through the often lengthy onboarding processes, many of us will take the path of least resistance. The tendency can and has been exploited. But I, and some in the industry, are concerned that this legislation will have unintended consequences that in fact lessen competition in the sector, not strengthen it. Advertising may have certain negative connotations in today's highly commercialised environment, but the ability to advertise is an important mechanism for new products to break into markets and to disrupt the landscape. Without the ability to advertise new products, incumbents can become easily entrenched, and without constant competitive pressures, performance and consumer outcomes can weaken. While many Australians are disengaged with super, we should not simply take this as an accepted fact. The start of a new job could be an important opportunity for Australians to re-evaluate their retirement savings options, and to the extent that we can, we should be encouraging Australians to be engaged. Actually, it is an area where I think it would be appropriate to be spending government money in terms of advertising, perhaps much more so than other government-funded advertising campaigns. And advertising more broadly has a role to play in this. Obviously, we don't want this to be used as an opportunity for employers to cross-sell conflicted products. But a blanket ban, as was originally canvassed, is not a viable option, because the obvious beneficiaries of a blanket ban are default funds. It is estimated that around 60% of Australian super fund members are invested through a default super fund option selected by their employer, often their first employer. But even if these funds were a good option at the time, there is no guarantee that performance is sustained. In 2022, ASIC reported that 9 of these default products were failing the performance test, impacting around 800,000 members, according to Morningstar. If we put a blanket ban on the advertising of products when onboarding, there is one less opportunity for consumers to assess their current fund and adjust their choices if necessary. In response to this feedback from industry, the government has made certain exemptions to a blanket ban. For example, in the minister's second reading, he advised that advertising would be permitted if the advertised product was, first, 1, the employee's staple product as confirmed by their ATO, 2, the employer's default product, or 3, a Moir super product that meets certain requirements, including passing the annual performance test. These are sensible changes, and the legislation requires advertising of new products to be accompanied by information about current staple product to highlight the benefits or not of switching products. But as the FSC points out, the explanatory memorandum outlines that showing staple products requires collecting information from ATO Commissioner, which adds an administrative barrier to finding staple products. Currently, onboarding platforms are able to use third-party verification services to find staple products through fund information rather than the ATO. This process is often faster, but can admittedly be less reliable. The FSC is concerned that by making the ATO the single source of truth, this will result in administrative delays that mean, in effect, only default funds will be shown under these exemptions. This, I believe, is not the intention of the bill. So while I accept that this bill has good intentions, I accept that there is some scope for this bill to create unintended consequences. And I think this is the piece that I think is really important for the government to measure and keep pursuing and keep an eye on, to see if it does have these unintended consequences, then the government will have to swiftly act to change this. It will take time to implement, but this is important in assessing the effectiveness of this bill. But I would like to talk to the cumulative impact more broadly of some of the super reforms that have been put forward in this place over the past few years. Superannuation policy constantly grapples between balancing consumer protections for a relatively disengaged cohort of Australians against the important point of driving competition. I am concerned that the cumulative impact of superannuation policy, including the performance test, which the Treasurer has recently agreed to review, which I think is really important to review, not to remove the performance test, but to make sure that the performance test is to minimise the unintended consequences on reducing competition and innovation that I do believe the performance test does at the moment, has created less competitive pressures on funds to outperform and to deliver for their clients. This has a cost, albeit hidden, and I'm concerned that this legislation may add to that cost. And I do want to argue that this should worry us all. Australia has an extraordinary amount of our resources in superannuation, $4 trillion. It's absolutely remarkable. We have one of the biggest pension pots in the world, in that cumulative fund. We have some of the biggest pension funds in this small little country of ours in the world, while only having 27-odd million people. But the question really is, we need those funds to be as competitive as possible with each other if they are going to be using that $4 trillion worth of Australian assets, which is over 100% of our GDP. So this really matters what that money is doing. If that money is going to be used to, firstly, the greatest benefit of the members, and secondly, making sure that it is actually serving the country as well. And just to put it on the record, the premise, I will never walk away from the sole object of superannuation is, frankly, to earn returns for their members. So I'm never going to sort of violate that principle. But I do recognise that with that big asset pool, in some ways, a super fund, they have an enormous impact on our economy. And that impact, through different pieces of legislation, can be more or less positive, both for the members and for the funds. And I want to draw your attention to a particular example, and that's super funds' investment in innovation. So you would think, with the sort of high level of superannuation funds and pension funds available, that Australian super funds would be investing in innovation in Australia, particularly given that sort of VC funds and PE funds have been shown to significantly outperform the ASX and the more traditional listed areas. However, what we have seen is that super funds have reduced their exposure to innovation, and particularly VC and PE over recent years. We have seen that members of the industry, the VC PE sector, have told me that in the last 5 years the major super funds have not invested in a new VC fund over that period of time. So the super funds are investing in the ones they're used to, but they're not actually investing in the new innovation in the VC and PE area. And I think this should be concerning us, because who is funding innovation? Innovation is a perfect I think these sorts of industries are perfect sort of assets for super funds, in the sense that they are long duration and need patient capital. But also have the opportunity to really, on good ones, really earn extraordinary returns. So there should be the place, but they're not currently. It's why I've been pushing, and I really respect and I appreciate the Treasurer being open to looking at Your Future, Your Super, and ASIC, and expanding the ASIC's review of RG 97 to include superannuation, to include funding for innovation. But I do think this is the stuff that we need to be aware of in some of this. We are trying to protect consumers, but if it ends up that we are just entrenching providers that do not have to really show their worth to consumers, who are not subject to strong competition, then we will be doing a disservice to all the people who invest across our country in these superannuation funds. And that is the piece that I think it is really critical for the government to be monitoring as it brings in these sorts of changes. And so finally, I urge the government to deal in good faith with the Senate inquiry process and commit to waiting for this review to take place before pushing this legislation through the Senate. And I would actually say it would be great if the Senate inquiry could be done before this legislation is once again pushed through the House, because it means it is hard to vote on legislation without having the full information. But that is literally the modus operandi of this government. And I do think that I support the intent of this bill. And I think that my feedback has been that the Assistant Treasurer has done a great job of engaging with the industry and really been incredibly consultative, and that doesn't surprise me at all, because I think that's been his approach across many different areas. But I do think there is a danger here, and I do think it's important to make sure that this bill does actually strengthen consumer outcomes and we don't lessen competition. And so we need to be very careful that this bill actually lives up to its title, which is improving choice in superannuation. Thank you.
Before we proceed any further, I jumped the gun before, so can I ask if the amendment be seconded?
Second the amendment and reserve my right to speak, Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Kooyong. The original question was that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the honourable member for Fairfax moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting other words. The